I still remember the sound of my own breathing that morning. Not because it was loud, because it was disappearing. Have you ever tried to pull air into your lungs and felt like someone had wrapped steel cables around your chest? Every breath burned. Every inhale stopped halfway, leaving me dizzy and terrified. I leaned against the hallway wall, clutching my chest, whispering, "Mom, I can't breathe." She didn't even look up. She was standing at the kitchen counter stirring gravy, humming along to an old country song like it was any ordinary Saturday. Then she rolled her eyes. "Oh, quit faking it," she snapped. "Dinner won't cook itself. Get in the kitchen." For a second, I honestly thought she was joking. I was 33 years old, married with a 7-year-old son. We had driven 3 hours to spend Thanksgiving weekend at my parents' house because my mother insisted family belongs together. I wish I'd stayed home. Growing up, Mom had always believed sickness was weakness. Broken wrist? Walk it off. High fever? You're just being dramatic. Crying? Nobody likes a victim. I'd spent my entire childhood trying to prove I wasn't one. So when she dismissed me again, part of me almost believed her. Maybe it was anxiety. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe. Then my vision blurred. The room tilted. I grabbed the edge of the counter before crashing to the floor. "Dad!" I gasped, barely able to speak. My father looked over from the dining room, newspaper still in his hands. His face changed instantly. "Linda," he said sharply. "Something's wrong." Mom didn't even turn around. "What's wrong is she's trying to get out of helping," she muttered. "She always loved attention." Those words hit harder than the pain squeezing my lungs. Not because they were new, because after 33 years, she still saw me as the selfish little girl she'd invented in her mind. I wanted to argue. I wanted to scream. Instead, I couldn't breathe. My fingers had started turning pale. My lips felt numb. Every heartbeat pounded inside my ears louder than the voices around me. Dad finally dropped his newspaper and rushed toward me. "Honey, look at me," he said, kneeling beside me. "Can you stand?" I shook my head. "Barely." He reached for his phone before he could dial 911. Mom spun around, slapped his hand away, and said the words that changed everything. "If you call an ambulance," she hissed. Don't expect me to pay for her little performance. Dad froze. So did I. And in that terrifying silence, I realized this wasn't just another argument. My own mother had decided that proving she was right mattered more than whether I lived or died. Dad stared at Mom for one long, unbearable second. Then something inside him seemed to snap. "I don't care what it costs," he barked. "If my daughter can't breathe, I'm calling 911. He stepped away before Mom could stop him and dialed with shaking hands. I was barely conscious, curled up on the kitchen floor, every breath shorter than the last. My chest felt like it was collapsing inward. I could hear Dad explaining our address, his voice cracking with panic, while Mom stood with her arms folded as if she were watching a stranger make a scene. "They're sending an ambulance," Dad whispered, squeezing my hand. "Just stay with me." Mom let out an exaggerated sigh. "You've always babied her, Frank. This is exactly why she's so dramatic." I wanted to answer. I wanted to tell her that I wasn't acting, but all I could manage was a weak gasp that sounded nothing like words. Within minutes, I heard sirens outside. 2 paramedics rushed through the front door, carrying medical bags. The moment one of them looked at me, his expression changed. "Ma'am, can you hear me?" he asked calmly. I nodded. He clipped a monitor onto my finger while the other placed an oxygen mask over my face. The cool rush of oxygen felt like the first drop of rain after a desert drought. Then one of the paramedics looked at the monitor. "Her oxygen saturation is dangerously low," he said to his partner. The room instantly became more urgent. They moved quickly, asking questions I could barely answer. Dad stayed beside me the entire time. Mom remained near the sink, arms crossed. "I told you," she said loudly. "She has anxiety attacks all the time." The older paramedic slowly turned toward her. "Ma'am," he said firmly, "this is not an anxiety attack." The kitchen fell silent. Your daughter is experiencing a serious respiratory emergency. Waiting any longer could have been fatal. For the first time all morning, Mom didn't have anything to say. She simply blinked. No apology, no concern, just silence. As they loaded me onto the stretcher, I caught one last glimpse of her standing in that kitchen. She wasn't crying. She wasn't frightened. She looked annoyed, as though the ambulance had interrupted her holiday plans. Inside the ambulance, everything became a blur of flashing lights. Medical equipment and urgent voices. One of the paramedics started, and for a while another administered medication through a breathing treatment. Little by little, air began reaching places in my lungs that had felt completely closed off. I started crying, not because I was in pain anymore, but because I had finally realized something I had spent my entire life refusing to believe. A mother who truly loved her daughter would have been terrified. Mine had been irritated. And deep down, I knew that once the doctors told me exactly what had almost killed me, my mother's excuses would finally run out forever. The emergency room was a blur of bright lights, hurried footsteps, and voices I could barely follow. By the time the breathing treatment began to work, I felt completely drained. My chest still ached, but at least I could finally pull in enough air to speak. A doctor walked into my room holding a tablet. He looked at me, then at Dad, before saying something that made my stomach drop. "You didn't have a panic attack." I glanced toward Mom, who had finally arrived at the hospital looking more inconvenienced than concerned. The doctor continued, "You suffered a severe asthma attack that progressed into acute respiratory failure. Another 15 or 20 minutes, without treatment, could have ended very differently." Dad closed his eyes and covered his mouth. Mom immediately crossed her arms. "That seems a little dramatic," she muttered. The doctor stared at her in disbelief. "Ma'am," he replied, "I'm not being dramatic. I'm explaining how close your daughter came to dying." The room went completely silent. I kept waiting for my mother to rush over, waiting for her to grab my hand, waiting for her to whisper, "I'm so sorry." Instead, she looked directly at me and said, "Well, if you had told me it was that serious, I would have believed you." I felt something inside me break. Not my heart, that had cracked years ago. This was something deeper. It was the last tiny piece of hope I'd been carrying since childhood, the hope that one day my mother would finally choose me over her pride. She never did. Dad looked at her with tears in his eyes. "She begged you for help," he said quietly. "You called her a liar." Mom shrugged. "I made a mistake." "No," Dad answered. "You made the same mistake you've made for 30 years. I had never heard my father speak to her like that, ever. For most of my life, he'd stayed silent whenever she criticized me. He always claimed it was easier not to argue. But watching me nearly die had changed something inside him. He turned back to me. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I should have protected you years ago." Those words hit harder than anything else that day. 'Cause they were true. After Mom left the room without another word, one of the nurses quietly closed the door behind her. Then she looked at me with gentle eyes. "I don't usually say this to patients," she admitted, "but sometimes surviving isn't just about living through the medical emergency." She paused. "Sometimes it's surviving the people who were supposed to protect you." I couldn't stop crying, not because of what my mother had done, but because a complete stranger had shown me more compassion in 30 seconds than my own mother had shown me in 33 years, lying in that hospital bed, connected to monitors that had kept me alive. I made myself one promise. If I walked out of that hospital, I would never again beg for love from someone who had already proven I wasn't worth saving in her eyes. I was discharged 2 days later with new medications, a rescue inhaler, and one very clear instruction from my pulmonologist. "Stress is one of your biggest triggers," he said. "If you want to stay healthy, you need to avoid environments that put your body into constant survival mode." His words echoed in my head the entire drive home, because I already knew what my biggest trigger was. It wasn't pollen. It wasn't dust. It was my mother. The day after I got home, my phone rang. Mun. I let it go to voicemail. Her message lasted 23 seconds. I hope you've calmed down, she said. You're making this whole family look terrible. You should apologize to everyone for ruining Thanksgiving. I listened to it twice, not because it hurt, because it finally set me free. For the first time in my life, I didn't cry. I blocked her number. Then I blocked her everywhere else. No dramatic goodbye. No final argument. Just silence. Over the next few weeks, Dad started visiting on his own. One afternoon, he handed me a small photo album filled with childhood pictures. I should have stood up for you, he said, his voice trembling. I can't change the past, but I don't want to lose my daughter because I was too afraid to confront my wife. I hugged him tighter than I had in years. Healing didn't happen overnight, but it finally began. Months later, my son asked why Grandma never came around anymore. I smiled gently and told him, because our home is a place where people everyone who comes here is secure about rule. He simply nodded and went back to playing. Children understand healthy boundaries better than many adults do. Nearly a year passed before I heard another word about Mom. A family friend told me she'd been telling everyone that I had abandoned her for no reason. This time, nobody believed her. Dad had quietly shared the truth with the family. Even the paramedics' report and hospital records confirmed how critical my condition had been. The relatives who once defended her stopped calling me to make peace. Instead, they started asking why they had ignored the warning signs for so many years. As for me, I never sought revenge through shouting, insults, or public humiliation. My revenge was much simpler. I built a peaceful life she could never control again. I laughed without fear. I breathed without guilt. I raised my son in a home where asking for help was never treated as weakness. The woman who once told me, "Quit faking it, get in the kitchen," lost the only daughter who had spent 3 decades begging for her love. And I finally realized something beautiful. The greatest victory wasn't surviving the day I almost stopped breathing. It was learning that I never had to fight for love from someone who refused to give it. Sometimes, the happiest ending isn't getting an apology. It's discovering you no longer need one.